Everyone, we're just going to come back online now, and we have James Barber from Extinction Rebellion Ōtautahi via audio visual link, and here he is here. Hello, James. And once we've completed the Extinction Rebellion Ōtautahi submission, we'll move straight into James's individual submission. So over to you, James.
Right, kia ora koutou. E te tuatahi ake mihi ki te iwi o tēnei wahi, me te hitiri me te whakapapa o te wahi nei. E te tuatahi a mata mihi nui ki a koutou, I o koutou whakarongo mai. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. In terms of the Extinction Rebellion Ōtautahi submission, now is probably not the longest one you've got, but it's one of the long ones I've written. The key point that we want to really stress is that the council really needs to reflect the urgency of the climate crisis in its planning. If the council is actually going to halve emissions by 2030, which is certainly what is required by the science, then this actually needs to be, everything that the council does needs to be consistent with that. If that's actually going to happen, every decision made by the council needs to be consistent with that. And I get that, and we understand that that is not easy. Thankfully, you are actually a rather large organization with quite a few paid staffers who could actually do that. And there is the ability there for decisions to actually go through a little climate framework and to see whether or not that's actually consistent with a goal of halving emissions by 2030. In terms of the more specific points of our submission, most of those, I think, are fairly self-explanatory. Cycling infrastructure, it's very important that that continues. Community infrastructure, investing in communities is, in terms of livable communities and stuff like that, is also very important. Public transport, incredibly important and needs to continue. And we make a little note there about the state of the city's bus shelters, which quite frankly don't provide an awful lot of shelter. And a little point there with note that the fact that there's also a sort of equity issue there as well, because it tends to be people on lower incomes who use public transport. The third point we've got here is perhaps a little weird and finicky one, but I think is actually quite an important one. So this is to do with, it says playgrounds in the title, but really it's about civic amenities. And so if you're actually trying to encourage people to use active transport, then it's actually very important that a lot of civic amenities are provided. It's very easy if you have a car to hop in the car and drive home to go use the loo. But actually, if you're traveling by foot or by bike, that's actually a bit more challenging. So it is, or say if you get really thirsty, once again, it's easy to pop into a car, drive home to have a drink of water. But once again, amenities such as public toilets and drinking fountains would seem rather dull, but actually they're really important. And I'd say that it's important that those are provided in as many public spaces as possible, and that's why it's noted down as playgrounds, because that's sort of one of the big communal public spaces that the city council manages. And note that there are quite a few which do not in various suburbs. And so that would actually be one thing which seems very dull and insubstantial, but could actually do quite a service in terms of making active transport more possible. The other points there in terms of council-owned companies. So once again, it's actually very important that the council-controlled organisations are also consistent with plans. Now, I understand that these are held at arm's length by legislation, by central government, but actually, if, once again, emissions are going to be halved by 2030, which the science says needs to happen, then, and if this legislation is a barrier, say, for example, Christchurch International Airport has its own governing strategy, and, it sits at somewhat arm's length from the city council, and that's due to legislation, then I would suggest that the city council work with other city councils to push for changes to said legislation to allow for greater control of council organizations so that they can be consistent with action on issues such as climate change. You, of course, have probably heard time and time again people complaining about the Terrace Airport plan, but that is, of course, a large example. Now, I get that the council has limited ability and limited scope to tell Christchurch International Airport what to do. It does do I think, annual statements or something like that. But once again, if legislation is a barrier, then the city council should actually work and advocate to central government to get the legislation changed. Additionally, we have other examples, such as, for example, the Littleton Port Company, which is regularly involved with imports of blood phosphate and coal, neither of which are particularly desirable at the moment in terms of a climate crisis. Of course, blood phosphate has with it the added point about the connections to the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, which has been historically quite brutal. And once again, if legislation is in the way, then the city council should actually advocate to central government about that. Okay, those are really the points in terms of what we have from Extinction Rebellion Ōtautahi, talking to those key points in our submission, but obviously you already have the bulk of the submission. So now that gives me time for questions.
For sure. So, questions. Jimmy Chin.
Righto.
Only one question. You mentioned the playground. Every playground need a public toilet and a drinking fountain. But we are aware in citywide we have bigger scale playground or small size local playground. Whether you have any distinguish or not.
Did you pick that up, James?
So the question was about large playgrounds versus small playgrounds.
Yeah, well, I think what he was saying was that, that in terms of the provision of services at the playground itself, some playgrounds are specifically focused on people who live within walking distance. So slightly different issue than the larger parks. I think that was the point that he was making. Would you agree?
Yep, kei te marama. So Shirley Green, I believe, is one example of a quite large park which does not have drinking fountains or public toilets. There are a few around the city. Now, I understand that there's a statement that, the idea is that people would live nearby and walk to these, but to be perfectly honest, actually a lot of people drive. And one of the reasons for that in terms of a lot of playgrounds is that it's kind of socially acceptable for the kid to have a wee in the bushes. It's not really that socially acceptable for an adult. So I understand that, of course, there are limited resources and that there's a cost associated with extra amenities. But that is just one example.
But you would support the idea that perhaps there may be some gaps in our playground network that might need to be addressed, so that we could have a look at that.
It's a very good idea.
Yeah. Mike Davidson.
So, thank you for your presentation. Just another quick question around the playgrounds, as well as obviously water and toilets. What about shading? Do you think that's important that we look at that when we upgrade playgrounds?
Sorry, did you say shade?
Shade.
Yeah.
Shade sails or trees.
Yeah, that's moving a little bit out of the Extinction Rebellion Ōtautahi purview. But speaking as a parent, yes. In terms of the just responding in terms of points around toilets and water and drinking fountain infrastructure, you have an awful lot of investment in cycleways. And so has there been a look at what infrastructure there is in terms of drinking fountains and toilets following those arterial routes in terms of arterial active transport routes.
Yep. Okay. Sarah and Aaron.
Thanks, James. What do you say to those who've submitted saying that putting in place this infrastructure and spending money on things like cycleways now isn't important, and that we should defer it and do it later?
I guess the issue is that sadly that will always be the case from some people. That they will also say that, oh, this isn't that important. The thing is that, to be honest, with climate change, there's going to be increasing need for investment in core civic infrastructure, because there'll be increasing extreme weather events, there'll be increasing all sorts of natural disasters. And as such, it's actually very important that the investment is made in stuff now, because to be perfectly honest, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, you'll just be dealing with the latest flooding event.
Thank
To
you.
be perfectly realistic about that.
Aaron, I'll let you ask your quick question quickly, but we're going to move straight on to your personal submission, James.
No, James, it will most likely be quite similar, but I agree with majority of things you've raised, James. But the one I would ask a question around is, does Extinction Rebellion have a position around the number of buses we have at the moment that don't have people on them? So you're running a large fleet, which is not reducing carbon because it's running around empty. Do you think that is the future of transport, or should we be looking at other options? Do you guys have a position? Because you must see this and go, oh, this hurts.
That sounds like an issue for Environment Canterbury to me, but because I thought they managed the bus network. But I guess there's collaboration between the councils in terms of routes and who does bus shelters and things like that. The issue I would say is that the bus network is not sufficient. And we have put this in our council, in our submission to Environment Canterbury. And there was a report done last year, particularly about the network, the provision to the eastern suburbs, about the provision of bus services in the eastern suburbs, particularly about the accessibility of medical care in the middle of the pandemic. There was a report. I can email that to the council. I'm not sure whether that was included in this submission. Looking at the references, it was not, but it was included in the submission to Environment Canterbury, because that was a core part, since they operate the actual buses. Well, they contract buses. So you need a decent service with a decent number of buses in order for people to actually use it. The thing is, at the moment, the bus network is not actually an adequate service or an adequate alternative to cars. So of course people drive everywhere, because there's bugger all buses you can catch.
All right. Well,
I'm going to need that.
That's okay, James. Can we just move on to your personal submission? And I mean, I think some of the issues are across, similar.
Oh, they absolutely are. They absolutely are. I mean, I kind of took the Extinction Rebellion in one of the central and sort of added my own little pieces to that, as will be clear to any of you who have read them. I think the key points I would stress in terms of the personal one is, first off, I'd actually like to back what Ashley Campbell has said in terms of her submission earlier about the state of some of the roads in the east, particularly the concerns noted around Pages Road. I've certainly cycled there with the kids, and it's actually, frankly, really scary in places. In terms of this, so this is the